Hi there, and welcome to this two-part webinar series on perfectionism and procrastination. I'm Dr. Dustin Kieschnick. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist and also a VMHS facilitator. I'll be leading you through both parts. Today, we're going to cover part one, understanding and managing perfectionism in veterinary medicine. And we'll continue with part two around procrastination, perhaps fittingly, at a later time. Well, so before we begin, I want to mention that this webinar is generously sponsored by Not One More Vet by NOMV. And I also wanted to share a little bit about my background. I have been a VMHS, a veterinary mental health support facilitator, for over 5 years. I also serve as an assistant clinical professor at UCSF at the University of California, San Francisco. And before that, I spent 9 years in the Marines, and so am a US Marine Corps veteran. So let's dive right in. What is perfectionism? There are a lot of different definitions for perfectionism, but what we're going to focus on is the need to be or appear perfect and to believe that it's possible to achieve perfection. Perfectionism is often seen as a trait that increases one's chances of success, especially in professional and career settings. Now, we're going to touch on this a lot more in the slides to come, but the key point in this is that perfectionism is about being perfect. It's also about being mistake free, prioritizing not making mistakes. And we realize that it can be forced on us in some way by society, by this expectation of never making a mistake. If we look a little bit about at if we look into um, how Brene Brown, a writer, research professor at University of Houston Graduate College of Social Work, how she defines and distinguishes perfectionism. She distinguishes between perfectionism and healthy behaviors. So let's think about that for a second. That there's a difference, what she claims, between perfectionism and healthy behaviors. She says perfectionism is not the same thing as striving to be your best. They're different. Perfectionism is not about healthy achievement and growth. That's super interesting because what she's saying, and I think that there's a lot of evidence to support this claim, is that perfectionism is often associated with being your best, but in fact, it's not. In a lot of ways, it actually hinders healthy achievement and growth. She goes on to explain that while many of us strive to be perfect, whether purposefully or unknowingly, it's really an attempt to protect ourselves against the pain of blame, judgment, or shame. So, in essence, it's this protective mechanism that keeps us at, or at least ostensibly keeps us safe from feeling the effects of blame. Because blame hurts, judgment hurts, shame hurts. And so perfectionism might be this way to protect us against that. And I guess the implicit reasoning or the implicit logic behind it is that if I can be perfect, then I'll be impervious to these things. I'll be impervious to blame. I won't be able to be judged. I won't feel shame because if I don't make a mistake, then I won't have to feel that. A little bit along those same lines of what Brene Brown mentioned is this link between perfectionism and mental health. Perfectionism is frequently accompanied by damaging self criticism. And what this can lead to is self defeating thoughts and behaviors that make it more difficult to achieve objectives. Self criticism can exacerbate feelings of stress and failure, right? If we break that down a little bit, This is the nefarious side of perfectionism, this really, really hypercritical side that says, what does it say about you if you make a mistake, if you're not perfect? And what that can do is create this cycle of self-defeating thoughts and behaviors. It can make everything feel so much more stressful because there's now this acute and significant fear of failure. And it can lead to anxiety, depression, and other mental health concerns. So let's take a look at what causes perfectionism. If we think about insecure early attachment, those who experience a less than secure attachment with parental figures when they were young may have difficulty with acceptance as adults. And if I break that down a little bit more, when we think about attachment, we think about the relationship with caregiving individuals. Those could be parents, those could be guardians, those could be grandparents, whoever has the major role in our our upbringing and has the major role in caregiving and raising us. And when an attachment is insecure, there's a lot of anxiety associated with it. So what it says is that care or affection or connection was sort of sparse and unpredictable. And so when it's unpredictable, sort of converts to this insecurity around it. And what ends up happening is in these cases, a lot of times kids want to prove their worthiness through their achievement, right? Because it ends up being the only really tangible thing. Like when you achieve, that's when you notice the affection, that's when you notice the praise, that's when you notice the attention. And attachment is really about attentiveness. Um, and you know, and what we find is that children and teens with a history of high achievement sometimes feel overwhelming pressure to live up to their previous accomplishments. It creates this cycle of achievement that is this self almost this perpetuating cycle where I experience it I achieve something and I experience praise, so I achieve more. And when we're kids, we're trying to make sense of the world. We're trying to make sense of different stimuli based on our own interpretation of it. And in insecure attachment, what happens is that kids make sense of the world in by way of what what they do or what or sort of the connection or association with whatever whenever they receive affection or whenever they receive attention, right? And this cycle of accomplishment gets reinforced by I accomplish something, I get praise. I accomplish something, I get praise. I accomplish something, I get praise until it becomes integral to us as a person that we're completely associated with achievement. And in essence, it creates this sort of hamster wheel effect where we have to keep going. We feel like we have to keep striving, keep achieving. But the question is, when do you let yourself step off that hamster wheel? If we look at other factors involved with perfectionism, and specifically as to whether it develops and how it persists, what keeps it going. One of those is the fear of disapproval and disappointing others. This is the flip side of the slide before, where if we're oriented towards achievement, there is nothing more devastating to disapproval or disappointing someone. It can inculcate this fear in us of disapproval, of feeling that sensation of someone feeling disappointed in us. Another factor is that it can lead to insecurity. feelings of inadequacy, imposter syndrome, feelings of failure, and low self-worth, right? Because we have this expectation of being perfect, and anything less than that can be perceived as failure. And when we fail, then it lowers our self-worth, makes us feel insecure, it makes us feel like we don't belong. And another factor is that it can uh, be associated with additional mental health diagnoses like obsessive compulsive disorder, OCD, which a major component is this compulsion for things to be just right. Every detail has to be oriented in a very specific and therefore perfect way. Now, let's look at this in terms of veterinary medicine, right? We see, or over my time at VMHS, I've seen such a link with perfectionism and veterinary medicine. And it's because veterinary medicine is often a vulnerable, unpredictable, and constantly changing work environment. Now, some folks can thrive in this environment. It can drive some folks, but those uncertainties can be incredibly problematic for others, especially for perfectionists. So something that ends up happening is that perfectionists often accept full responsibility for cases and events, including the inevitable losses that occur. Part of veterinary medicine is that there are losses, there are outcomes that are unfavorable. And what often happens with a perfectionist is that they accept full responsibility, even when there are things outside of their control, as so often there are in these types of cases, especially around loss, especially around unfavorable outcomes. There's often so many other factors that are non-controllable that no matter what you did, even if you did something differently, it might have never changed the outcome. But perfectionists have a really, really hard time accepting that. And in some ways, it can almost be easier to accept full responsibility, to take everything on um, for yourself, because then it, in a way, it gives us this sense of control, right? If even if I made the mistake, I can control it, and I don't have to account for the things that are uncontrollable because those are uncertain. And when they're uncertain, I can't plan for them. And when I can't plan for them, that's really anxiety provoking because then I can't be assured that it's going to be perfect or that it's going to be mistake free. And so you can see how this chain of factors really contributes to how perfectionism shows up, especially in veterinary medicine. And we'll talk a little bit more about how some of this perfectionism is really externally generated. But I have another slide for that, and we'll talk about that in a bit. Now, let's also look at some signs that you might be a perfectionist, right? We have to be able to know it when we see it. Now, most people engage in perfectionism from time to time, especially in certain areas of life that are deeply, deeply important to them. So, as an example, let's say wedding planning, right? Even somebody that's not normally oriented towards perfectionism could take on perfectionistic tendencies in this scenario because they want everything to be perfect. They want everything to be right. They want everything to go off without a mistake, without a hitch. Contrast that with people who are perfectionists, who feel the need to achieve perfection constantly across all aspects of their lives. So the major difference is that although or while many of us can be, or most of us can be prone to perfectionism, the difference with perfectionists is that it's constant, it's pervasive, it happens in every aspect. There is no aspect in life that cannot be perfect, that where a mistake is even tolerable. Another sign is that may use perfectionism to justify certain unhelpful behaviors and tendencies. Now, what does this look like? This can look like an email that might take 20 minutes, taking 5 hours. It may look like staying after work for 7 hours so that the notes and the documentation is exactly right or up to the standard that you have set. Now, you might hear that and say like, oh, but it's generally good to stay after work, right? Or it's generally good to make sure that an email is checked and that it comes across in the way I want it to come across. And that takes time. And I agree with you. But where perfectionism comes in is that we justify those behaviors, we justify those unhelpful tendencies in order that so that we feel better about that time and the effort that we're spending. So it's really just about maintaining perfectionism rather than getting it just right. Or it's about obsessing over an email when something that's good enough would probably suffice. So other signs maybe a perfectionist is you may not be able or willing to perform a task unless you know you can do it flawlessly. Right? This is part of perfectionism that can be really, really insidious. It says like, if I don't know that I'm going to do it flawlessly, then I might just not do it, or I might procrastinate it, which is something we'll talk about in part two. You may view the end product as the most important part of any undertaking as compared to the learning or effort involved. And one way in which we see this is focusing so much on getting 100 on the test that you don't really account for the learning or the material doesn't become as important. The most important part is making that 100. And something that perfectionism doesn't allow us or doesn't let us recognize is that learning is a part of learning is failure. Failure is an integral part of learning. We learn more from our mistakes than anything else. And when we take on really, really perfectionist tendencies, when we're perfectionists, we don't allow ourselves that part of learning. And so we miss out. And as a result of this, may focus less on completing a task to the best of your ability. It's only about the end product. And you may not see a task as finished until the result is perfect according to your standards. So if I use the note example from before, you know, I could spend this much time and the note be good enough, or I could raise it to the standards that I have, which are a little bit more perfectionist. And really they could be about the same, but the effort involved is so much more here, and it can become exhausting. So like I said, we'll talk a lot more about procrastination uh, in the context of perfectionism, but I want to mention it here because we really want to make this association with procrastination and a loss of opportunity. So we mentioned on the slide before that people with perfectionism may not want to engage in a task unless they are absolutely certain of success. And as a result, we may prevent ourselves from engaging in learning activities, engaging in opportunities that might be beneficial to us because we're uncertain about the outcome. It may take an excessive amount of time and energy to complete a task that does not typically take others long or as much effort. If I go back to the email example, what may take someone 20 minutes might take a perfectionist 6 hours. And it's not that there's a difference necessarily in the amount of time, it's in the magnitude of the difference. That over here is so much, it's significantly more effort. Its magnitude's greater than the one over here. And so I say all this to for us to really keep this in mind that perfectionism, you know, in a lot of ways we think that We think that the extra effort leads to extra success when really it may be a bit of an untruth that we might tell ourselves. So, what are some of the different types of perfectionism? So, there are a few different distinct types that are thought to exist. And while these types share similar behaviors, their motives and outcomes can be very different. There's some overlap, definitely, but these tend to be categorically a bit different. The first is self-critical perfectionism. This type of perfectionism, this type of perfectionist is more prone to becoming intimidated by the goals they set for themselves rather than feeling motivated. Let's think about that. Goal setting should really be this exciting activity. It should be this orientation towards the future that says, look what I'm going to achieve. But for a perfectionist, it can be incredibly intimidating because instead of thinking about the thing that I could achieve, inevitably what sets in is like, what if I don't achieve? What if I can't get there? What if I, what if I miss it? What if I set a goal and I'm not able to make it? That's devastating. And it can create such a fear that even the entire activity of goal setting can be incredibly anxiety provoking. And as a result, may feel more hopeless or that goals will never become a reality because in a sense we might have too much fear to really set them in motion because of the fear of failure. Now, research suggests that self-critical perfectionism is more likely to lead to negative emotions such as distress, avoidance, anxiety, and self-condemnation. Avoidance is a really, really key one because we are, like I mentioned before, we're hardwired as humans to escape pain, to avoid pain. And so when we become intimidated or feel fear of our goals, might incentivize us to avoid it. And that actually, while we think it's perfective, uh, while we think it's protective, it actually does us a disservice. This is um, the external type of perfectionism that I was mentioning earlier when I talked about perfectionism in veterinary medicine. It's the socially prescribed perfectionism. Now, this type describes the demand for excellence often placed by society, our clients, patients, donors, others, on people with careers that require extreme precision and or who work in life and death situations. It's this expectation of society that everything has to be mistake free. We see this in malpractice suits. It gets reinforced by our legal system. We see this in complaints. It gets reinforced in that way. And so individuals with socially prescribed perfectionism frequently experience more hopeless thoughts, stress, and a higher risk for self harm and suicidal ideation. Like the expectation and pressure is so great that it can become unbearable because the thought of making a mistake is unbearable. So, what are some strategies for overcoming perfectionism? Right? We know what it is, we know what causes it, we know how it looks. So, what do we do? The first thing is to have awareness. Now, awareness is an often overlooked aspect of overcoming. It's an often overlooked strategy, but it is so powerful because by having the courage to acknowledge our perfectionistic tendencies, we can begin to better understand the role they play in our lives. And we must remember that these do not define us and that we can stop letting them dictate our future at any time, beginning today. Awareness really gives us the opportunity to make a change to something. because if we're aware of it, then we can decide what we want to do with it. If we go on sort of with it under beneath our awareness, then it's more difficult to navigate. We have much less control about. We have much less control of it because we almost don't even know in the ways in which it exists. Another strategy is to identify. Pay attention to the images and scenes that replay in your mind when the urge to be perfect arises. What's happening in them? What's scary about them? Often, what will happen is this will come up in images of failure or images that convey the fear that you have if something is not perfect. And being able to identify these thoughts, these images, these scenes that come into your mind, then it allows you to challenge them. It allows you to counteract them with more realistic scenarios that are based on experience and evidence. Oftentimes, a fear is the most catastrophic scenario that we can think of. Often, the reality is much shorter than the catastrophe, and so we have to, by identifying, we can make room for different different realities, different alternative futures, right? That are not just the thing that we fear. It also gives us room to associate them with success, to associate them with positive things, right? Something that's often overlooked or you look at it and you're like, well, how would that really help? It's gratitude towards yourself. This one's actually super important because whenever you feel the need to be perfect, attempt to focus on what you're grateful for instead. So, as an example, if you're afraid that others won't be good enough, if you're afraid that your efforts won't be good enough unless they're perfect, remind yourself of your extensive years of training and the knowledge you hold, right? Let's actually think, let's go into the example that I just mentioned, right? When I first mentioned that sentence, I made a mistake. And so what I could do with that is that, like, oh my God, I'm a horrible presenter. I just messed up on words. I'm not perfect. And if it's not perfect, then it's no good. On the other side of that, I can say, you know what? I have this opportunity to share this knowledge, to share this expertise with others that hopefully can help them. And I may make some mistakes along the way, and that's okay. Right? Thank yourself for working so hard, the sacrifices, the long nights of studying, overnight shifts, everything it took to get to where you are. Now, we tend to ruminate on all the potential negative outcomes in a situation in an attempt to problem solve or prepare ourselves for the worst case scenario. This is where writing comes in. Writing gives us this opportunity to really externalize our thoughts instead of them being in this spin cycle that's just turning and turning and turning in our minds. It allows us to put them on paper, view them with a different perspective, right? And once we're more and it allows us to be more likely to generate helpful solutions because it gives us emotional distance from. Another strategy is reading. Like reading a book about someone you admire who suffered with and overcame a challenging situation can offer very insightful perspectives. They can be an exemplar. They can be this prototype of a person that allows us to not have to feel like we have to be perfect. It gives us some leeway. It normalizes. And then the last one is to act, doing something good enough. Our fears are created by our minds in a misguided effort to prepare and protect us. But when we face our fears, they automatically become weaker because we realize that the reality isn't as dark as what we conjured up in our imagination. This allows us to be good enough rather than perfect while keeping our values. So, thank you so much for your attention to this webinar. If you want to learn more, please visit NOMV's website. NOMV curates a variety of resources for support staff that can be found on their site, on our site at NOMV Resources. There's informative webinars. Additionally, there's NOMV's Lifeboat program, which provides anonymous peer support for veterinary professionals, and Clear Blueprint, which is a workplace well-being program. Navi's list is a database of peer submitted resources, and we also offer support grants for individuals and emergency grants for clinics. So if you have a question, please do not hesitate to let me know. Reach out to vmhs at navi.org. Lastly, I want to make some time to go over the references that were involved with the making of this presentation. So I'll stay on each slide for a few seconds, and you can see everything, all the sources that were drawn on to create the content for this presentation. Thank you so much for your time. I will be back with you in when we go into part two around procrastination. I'm going to try and not put it off too long or too far before getting there, and I hope to see you back then. Thanks so much.